everyone, my name is Mehrgol Tiv, and I'm eager to kick off this exciting symposium by telling you about our project called The Talk of the Town, a network approach to characterizing bilingual conversational topics in Montreal. This is based on a recently published paper with my list of co-authors listed on the screen. I would like to start by telling you a short story. Many of you are probably familiar with US Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC. Her family is Puerto Rican, and she is an English and Spanish bilingual. Recently, a group of writers got together and published an anthology of stories about her, and one of these writers was Natalia Sylvester, another Latinx woman who was born in Peru and is an English-Spanish bilingual. In an excerpt, she's reflecting on what some people have called AOC's broken Spanish, and she's thinking about her own use of English and Spanish, and so she writes, "What I couldn't have known is that my Spanish was never fated to be perfect. How could it be when English was the main vehicle through which I consumed everything? It was the language of my friends, my teachers, my textbooks, and the movies, TV shows, songs, and stories I loved." She goes on to say, "But when you speak your first language only at home, it becomes your second. It becomes the carrier of all things domestic." Now, this really stood out to me because it perfectly captures the idea that I want to share with you today, that different people use their various languages to talk about different things in different spaces. In addition to personal experiences like the one I just read, research stemming from fields such as sociolinguistics tells us that bilingualism is a diverse, complex, and multifaceted set of experiences. For example, Hoffman provided early empirical evidence for this idea when he demonstrated that young Spanish-English bilinguals living in a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood in New York City mostly use Spanish with their parents and English with their siblings. Interestingly, when these youth discussed work and school topics with their parents, they would switch to English. Now, Grosjean extended this idea through his writing on the complementarity principle, or the idea that people use their languages for specialized purposes. And more recent work from Lopez and Ortega on language brokers and heritage language speakers continue to make clear that there's no such thing as one type of bilingual experience. Research from psycholinguistics is starting to show that these coarse differences in the context of bilingual language use, such as at home or at work, constrain certain aspects of brain and behavior. For example, there's the adaptive control hypothesis by Green and Abudalebi, which distinguishes single from dual language contexts, and these are discussed to have implications for executive control functions. Recently, Beatty Martinez and colleagues probed bilinguals living in 3 different locales: Puerto Rico, Grenada, Spain, and suburban Pennsylvania. They also found that the linguistic milieu of the environment has an effect on executive control functions. And lastly, innovations from our own group have applied Shannon's entropy to the context of bilingual language use. And through this, Gullifer and colleagues have been able to show that bilingual language proficiency and executive control may be differently impacted by language diversity depending on the communicative context in which language diversity is measured. Nevertheless, the quantitative tools to finally characterize subtle individual differences in bilingualism continue to be limited. And as a result, many models and empirical work continue to be somewhat broad-stroked and assume homogeneity. Our proposal with this work is the novel application of network science, which is both a theoretical and methodological approach. We will leverage its computational power to represent the complex dynamics of bilingual language experience across contexts and languages. Network science functions through a system of nodes and edges. So the nodes represent entities, such as brain regions or friends that someone may have, and the edges represent the relationships between these entities, such as white matter tracts or when 2 people know each other. As a result, network science has become a tool harnessed across a wide variety of fields to answer complex questions. And the cognitive sciences in particular have seen an upward trend in the application of network science to questions of language, creativity, and dreaming. A great deal of this pioneering work has been led by our symposium co-chair, Dr. Mike Vidovich. Now, that being said, this work is the first that we know of that has applied network science to study self-reported aspects of bilingualism. There have been a few works, such as by Kim and colleagues in 2014, that have used network science to represent multilingual Twitter use. Kim et al.'s study in particular revealed very interesting patterns of online language use. specifically that bilingual tweeting communities are bridges between otherwise disparate monolingual tweeting communities. Moreover, and directly related to this work, they demonstrated that the bilingual Twitter community relies on different languages to tweet about different topics, such as politics or leisure. We also propose that applying network science to represent the multivariate nature of bilingualism provides different answers than other methods like PCA or principal component analysis. With a network approach, we are creating a system of interconnected variables, whereas PCA depends more on underlying correlations between those variables. And taken together, we arrive at the goal of this study, which is to use the richness and flexibility of network science to gain a more granular look into the context of bilingual conversational topics among our sample of Montreal bilinguals. So what we did is recruit 115 bilingual adults living in Montreal who know English and French. Many of them knew a third language, and most are raised in highly educated households and born in Canada. These folks completed a survey in which they self-reported what language or languages they used to talk about 21 different conversational topics, such as the news, gossip, sports, etc. And they did this across 5 communicative contexts: work, school, their current home, with their family that they don't live with, and the social context. We then put the data into a network structure by determining whether each pair of conversational topics, like news and gossip, were discussed in the same communicative context and language. We did this for each participant, and then we averaged across all participants. We created 2 types of networks, and here is a quick reminder of the basic components of a network before we continue. So first, we have the context networks, which represent each topic as a node, and the edge between the nodes represents whether the 2 topics were discussed in the same communicative context, hence the name of context networks. We then weighted the edge by the average number of languages that were used to talk about those 2 topics in that given context. Our second network type is the language network, which is the mirror image of the context networks. So nodes again represent topics like news and gossip, but now edges represent whether 2 topics are discussed in the same language. And this is then weighted by the mean number of communicative contexts that the 2 topics are discussed in that language. So we pulled out 3 network measures from each of our networks. The first is called network size, which is the number of conversational topics discussed in the same communicative context or in the same language. Second is network density, which is the number of edges divided by the total number of possible edges. And this gives a sense of the overall network interconnectedness. And third is edge strength, which is the sum of adjacent edge weights for one node averaged across all nodes. And this is the most interesting measure, in my opinion, because it bridges what is talked about across communicative contexts and across languages, thus bringing together our 2 questions of interest. And lastly, we were interested in thematically grouping the types of conversational topics that were discussed in the dominant versus non-dominant language. So we applied a modularity-based community detection algorithm to the language networks in particular. So here are our results for the context networks. Let me first orient you to this figure. Each network here represents the average of a different context, with work being on the far left and social on the far right. The nodes are the 21 conversational topics like news, gossip, politics. And the lines are the edges indicating whether 2 topics are discussed in the same communicative context. And the colors of the lines represent the number of languages that are used to discuss each pair of topics in a given communicative context. What we see is that few languages are used in the work context based on all of the yellow that you see, which means there's mostly a single language at play here. And in contrast, there are multiple languages being engaged in the social context, as illustrated by the overwhelming blue. In addition, network size, which is not shown in this figure, also varies between contexts. Here, work has the smallest network size, meaning that some conversational topics are not discussed at work, and social has the largest network size, meaning that most conversational topics are discussed in social settings. And together, these findings converge with the idea that the work context is compartmentalized, and the social context is integrated. And this applies both across the number of topics and the number of languages that are used to talk about those topics. Now for the language networks. So notice here that the color scale is slightly different. Here, the hot pink and purple colors of the dominant language network mean that this language is used across more communicative contexts than the non-dominant language. So overall, we find that all of the network measures of the dominant language significantly exceed those of the non-dominant language. This means that the dominant language is used to speak about more conversational topics across more communicative contexts, and it is more interconnected than the non-dominant language, as expected. The third finding comes from the community detection of the language networks. This analysis returned 2 meaningful groups in the dominant language, but 3 meaningful groups in the non-dominant language. Let's dig a little bit deeper into the 3 meaningful groups in the non-dominant language. We refer to these as social, personal, and intellectual. For example, in the white circles, we have topics such as culture, family, family activities, and community. We can qualitatively make sense of this type of grouping, topics that are socially oriented but still close to the home, which is what we call the social community. Now compare this to the 2 general groupings in the dominant language, where the previously distinct 3 communities now seem to overlap. Thus, we have social intellectual and social personal. And together, this suggests that the non-dominant language is used for more specialized purposes than the dominant language. Now to conclude. So we demonstrate that network science can be used to graphically represent and quantitatively characterize subtle, complex dynamics and bilingual language experience across various contexts. Our results converge with past findings outlined by Gollifer and Titone from the 2016 Canadian Census. In that work, language entropy was applied for workplace languages in Montreal, and it was found to be more compartmentalized at work than in the home context. And it is interesting when one starts to think about these results in the context of Quebec's highly regulated language policies, one of which deems that French must be the primary language of the workplace. And generalizing beyond Quebec, it speaks to a broader and very important point that the social political environment can and does constrain individual level experiences and behaviors, such as language choice. And lastly, we find that the non-dominant language, while predictably weaker than the dominant language, is still highly important to overall language use, and it's leveraged for specialized purposes. This aligns with the results that Kim and colleagues revealed from bilingual Twitter data when analyzing which languages were used to tweet about which topics. Moreover, I find it interesting that we found evidence that family, cultural, and community topics cluster together, just as Natalia Sylvester wrote about in her chapter on AOC. Excitingly, this work is just the tip of the iceberg. We have a new wave of work that focuses on social network analysis of bilingual language users, which will allow us to understand how bilinguals use their languages on a person-by-person basis. From here, ongoing work by our team, including one of my co-authors, Dr. Jason Gollifer, is relating these network dynamics to other individual differences in bilingual language experience, such as language entropy. And in addition, we are encouraged by the real-world aspect of social network analysis, and we are connecting these findings with other real-world psychological processes. For example, with language attitudes, which is a project led by our undergraduate co-author, Ruo Feng. Additionally, we are actively assessing how diversity in social networks relates to perceptions of racial bias and accentedness, which is the area of expertise of our other team member, recent Ph.D., Dr. Ethan Kutlu. If you're interested in the results I discussed today, please feel free to check out the paper. And if you're intrigued at all by our novel work on bilingual social network analysis, I'm happy to say that we're debuting part of this work in a poster tonight. And additionally, my co-author Jason Gollifer presented some novel findings regarding language entropy earlier in the conference, so do check those out. And lastly, I'd like to thank you for your interest and your attention on behalf of myself and the amazing group of co-authors you see here on this broad research project. Thank you so much.